I caught my 12-year-old grandson repairing my hearing aid, he said, trust me. And everything changed. The afternoon moved slowly, the kind of afternoon that felt stretched out and quiet in a way that made every small moment heavier. Sunlight came through the window in soft lines, resting on the floor and the edges of old furniture. Outside, there were faint sounds of life. Someone walking past, a distant engine, the wind brushing against leaves. But inside the house, everything felt muted and far away. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. The grandparents sat in their usual chair near the window, holding very still, as if moving too much might make things worse. The hearing aid in their ear buzzed softly, then cut out, then buzzed again. The sound came and went without warning, like a flickering light that refused to stay on. One moment, the ticking clock on the wall was clear. The next, it vanished into nothing. They frowned and tilted their heads slightly, hoping the sound would return. It didn't. Instead, a sharp crackle broke through, loud and uncomfortable, making them flinch. Their hand rose slowly to their ear, fingers careful and practiced, the way they always were with something fragile. They pressed gently against the device, as if that might convince it to behave. For a few seconds, it seemed to work. The room came back into focus. The faint hum of the refrigerator. The soft creak of the house settling. Even their own breathing felt louder. Relief washed over their face, brief but real. Then the sound dropped out again. They sighed, a long tired breath that came from deep in their chest. This wasn't new. It had been happening more often lately. Some days the hearing aid worked fine. Other days, like today, it felt like it had a mind of its own. They reached for the small table beside the chair, where a pair of reading glasses and a folded newspaper lay untouched. The grandparent tapped the hearing aid once more, then twice, each tap a little firmer than the last. The device answered with another burst of static, louder this time, before going silent again. Frustration crept in slowly, like a cloud covering the sun. It wasn't just about the sound. It was about what the silence meant. The quiet felt heavier than it used to. It felt lonely. They tried to remember when hearing had started to become a problem. It hadn't happened all at once. At first, it was just small things. Asking people to repeat themselves, turning the television volume up a little higher. Over time, those small things added up. Conversations became harder to follow. Laughter felt distant. Even simple moments began to slip away. The hearing aid was supposed to help. Most of the time it did. But when it failed, it reminded them how dependent they had become on this tiny piece of plastic and metal. Another crackle burst through, sudden and sharp. The grandparent winced and shook their head. That was enough. Slowly, carefully, they reached up and removed the hearing aid from their ear. The world instantly grew quieter, softer, like it was wrapped in thick cloth. They held the device in their palm, staring at it. It looked harmless enough, small and light. Hard to believe something so small could cause so much trouble. With a quiet motion, they placed it on the table beside them. The silence settled in fully now. No ticking clock. No hum from the kitchen. Just a deep, empty quiet that pressed in from all sides. They leaned back in the chair and closed their eyes. For a moment, they just sat there, breathing slowly, trying to let the frustration pass. But it lingered. It always did. Being alone in a quiet house felt different than it used to. Once, silence had been peaceful. Now it felt isolating. It made them feel cut off, like the world was happening somewhere else without them. Their thoughts drifted to earlier years, when the house had been louder. When voices filled the rooms, when footsteps ran down the hallway, when laughter came easily. Back then, silence was rare. Now, it seemed to be the default. They opened their eyes and looked around the living room. Everything was familiar. The worn couch. The framed photos on the wall. The old rug with faded patterns. This house held a lifetime of memories. And yet, in moments like this, it felt strangely empty. They rubbed their hands together slowly, a habit they had picked up without realizing it. Their fingers brushed against a faint scar on one knuckle, a reminder of some long-forgotten moment. Time had left its marks, both seen and unseen. Across the room, the grandson sat quietly on the floor, surrounded by a small pile of toys. He had been there the whole time, though the grandparent hadn't really noticed. He wasn't making much noise, focused on something in front of him. From the outside, he looked calm and occupied. But his eyes kept lifting toward the chair by the window. He had noticed the buzzing sound earlier. It had caught his attention right away. At first, he thought it was one of his toys making noise. Then he saw the grandparent's hand go to their ear, their face tightening with discomfort. He watched as the grandparent tapped the hearing aid, again and again. He noticed the way their shoulders tensed, the way they sighed. Even without fully understanding what was happening, he could tell something was wrong. The grandson didn't say anything. He wasn't the type to interrupt right away. He liked to watch first, to understand. He had learned that sometimes grown-ups didn't want questions when they were frustrated. He shifted slightly on the floor, careful not to make noise. His toy sat forgotten in his hands now. His attention was fully on the grandparent. When the hearing aid was finally removed and set on the table, he noticed the change immediately. The grandparent's expression softened, but it wasn't relief. It was more like giving up, just a little. The grandson frowned, his brow wrinkling in concentration. He had seen that look before. Not often, but enough to recognize it. It was the look of someone who felt tired and stuck. The room felt different now. Even he could sense it. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It felt heavy, like something important was missing. The grandparent opened their eyes and stared ahead, lost in thought. They didn't notice the grandson watching them. They didn't notice the way his head tilted slightly, the way his eyes moved from their face to the small device on the table. For a moment, the grandparent wondered if this was just how things would be from now on. Good days and bad days. Sound and silence. They hated the idea of needing help, even from a machine. They hated feeling helpless over something so basic. They thought about calling someone to fix it. But that meant appointments, waiting, explaining the problem again. It felt exhausting just thinking about it. They stood up slowly from the chair, joints stiff, and walked a few steps toward the kitchen. Without the hearing aid, the world felt distant. Their own footsteps were barely audible. They felt unsteady, not physically, but emotionally. They paused near the counter and rested a hand on it. The quiet pressed in again. It reminded them of how much they depended on others now, even if they didn't like to admit it. Behind them, the grandson stood up quietly. He moved carefully, like he didn't want to break the moment. He glanced at the hearing aid on the table again, then back at the grandparent. His mind was working, turning things over. He didn't fully understand how the device worked, but he understood enough to know it was important. He had seen the grandparent wear it every day. He had seen how it helped them hear him, laugh with him, respond when he spoke. He remembered times when the grandparent asked him to repeat himself. He remembered how they smiled apologetically afterward. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now, it seemed more important. The grandparent took another slow breath and turned back toward the living room. Their eyes landed on the hearing aid resting on the table. For a moment, they considered putting it back in, just to see if it would behave. But the thought of another loud crackle made them hesitate. They sat back down in the chair instead, shoulders slumping slightly. The frustration hadn't gone away. It had just settled deeper. Across the room, the grandson watched all of this silently. He felt a small knot form in his chest, a mix of concern and determination. He didn't know exactly what he could do, but he knew he didn't like seeing the grandparent like this. He took a small step forward, then stopped. Not yet, he thought. He wanted to be sure. He wanted to understand more before saying anything. The grandparent leaned their head back and closed their eyes again. The quiet filled the room, thick and unbroken. In that silence, neither of them spoke. But something had already shifted. The grandson was paying attention. And even though he hadn't said a word, His mind was already moving, already searching for a way to help. Later that day, the light in the house began to change. The sun moved lower, and the bright afternoon glow softened into something warmer and quieter. The grandparents sat in the same chair by the window, resting their hands in their lap. Without the hearing aid, time felt slower. Thoughts wandered more easily, and small worries seemed bigger than they should. They reached up out of habit, fingers brushing their ear, and then paused. Something felt wrong. Their hand lingered there for a moment before dropping back down. They looked toward the small table beside the chair. The hearing aid wasn't there. At first, they assumed they had simply forgotten where they put it. That happened sometimes. They leaned forward and scanned the table again, moving aside the glasses and the folded paper. Nothing. Their hearts skipped slightly. They stood up and looked around the room. The couch. The floor. The shelf near the wall. Still nothing. A faint worry began to rise, quiet but persistent. They walked slowly through the house, checking the places they usually went. The kitchen counter. The bathroom sink. The bedroom dresser. Each empty surface added to the growing unease. They tried to remember the last moment they had seen it. The memory came back clearly. They had taken it out because it was buzzing. They had set it on the table by the chair. They were sure of it. Confusion settled in. The house was small. Things didn't usually disappear. They felt a tightness in their chest, not panic yet, but close. That hearing aid wasn't just a tool. It was expensive. More than that, it was necessary. They retraced their steps, moving slower this time, checking again. They bent down carefully to look under the chair. Nothing. Under the couch. Still nothing. Their thoughts began to race. Had it fallen? Had they knocked it somewhere without realizing? The idea of it being lost for good made their stomach sink. They paused in the hallway and took a deep breath. Getting upset wouldn't help. They reminded themselves of that. Still, the silence pressed in harder now, mixed with worry. They turned toward the dining area, hoping maybe it had been placed there by mistake. As they stepped closer, they noticed something unusual. The grandson was sitting at the table. That alone wasn't strange. But what caught their attention was what was spread out in front of him. Small tools lay neatly arranged on the table. A tiny screwdriver. A cloth. Something that looked like a magnifying lens. And in the middle of it all, unmistakable even from a distance, was the hearing aid. The grandparent froze. For a moment, they simply stared, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. The boy leaned forward slightly, elbows off the table, shoulders relaxed but focused. His eyes were fixed on the small device in his hands. He wasn't playing. He was working. A sharp wave of alarm rushed through the grandparent. Their heart began to pound. Without thinking, they took a quick step forward, then another. "What are you doing?" they tried to say, but without the hearing aid, the words came out quieter than they expected. Still, the urgency was clear in their body language. The grandson didn't jump or look startled. He didn't hide the hearing aid or move the tools away. He simply looked up calmly, his face open and steady. The grandparents' worry grew stronger with every second. That device was delicate. One wrong move and it could be ruined completely. The thought of it breaking made their chest tighten. They reached out slightly, hand hovering in the air, unsure whether to grab the hearing aid or stop him. Their mind filled with questions all at once. How long had he had it? Had he dropped it? Had he already damaged something inside? The grandson noticed the fear on the grandparent's face. He tilted his head slightly, still holding the device carefully between his fingers. "Trust me," he said. Just 2 words. Calm. Clear. The grandparent stopped moving. Those words landed heavier than expected. Not because they explained anything, but because of how they were said. There was no fear in his voice. No joking. No excitement. Just confidence. They looked at his face more closely now. His eyes weren't playful or distracted. They were focused. Serious in a way that felt unusual for someone his age. The grandparents' hand slowly lowered back to their side. Their heart was still racing, but something else was there too. Surprise. Uncertainty. They glanced at the tools on the table again. They weren't toys. They looked real. Carefully chosen. Placed with intention. The grandson gently set the hearing aid down on the cloth. His movements were slow and careful, like he was handling something important. "I saw it earlier," he said quietly, "when it was making that noise." The grandparent listened closely, leaning in without realizing it. Even without the hearing aid, they caught his words. "It didn't sound right," he continued. "So I wanted to look." The grandparent swallowed. They still felt uneasy, but curiosity began to mix with the fear. "You shouldn't take things apart," they tried to say gently. "It could break." He nodded. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm being careful." He picked up the magnifying lens and held it over the device, adjusting the angle so the light hit it just right. His hands were steady. No rushing. No shaking. The grandparent pulled out a chair and sat down slowly across from him. They didn't take their eyes off the hearing aid. "I didn't open it yet," the grandson added. "I just wanted to see first." That small detail eased the tightness in the grandparent's chest, just a little. They hadn't realized how much they were holding their breath until it loosened. They studied him in silence for a moment. This wasn't the first time he had surprised them. He had always been curious, always liked figuring out how things worked. Broken toys never stayed broken for long when he was around. But this felt different. This wasn't a toy. This was something personal. Something important. "Why didn't you ask?" the grandparent asked softly. He looked up again. "You were upset," he said. "I didn't want to make it worse." The honesty of that answer hit them harder than they expected. They felt a small sting behind their eyes and blinked it away. They thought back to earlier, to the buzzing sound, the frustration, the silence. They had been so caught up in their own feelings that they hadn't noticed how closely he was watching. The grandson carefully adjusted the hearing aid, turning it slightly under the light. "Sometimes," he said, "things stop working because something small is wrong." The grandparent nodded slowly. That idea felt true in more ways than one. "I watched a video once," he continued, "about tiny electronics. Dust can get inside. Or a connection can be loose." The grandparent raised their eyebrows. They hadn't expected that. "I'm not guessing," he added quickly. "I'm checking." They looked at his hands again. Clean. Careful. Respectful. He treated the hearing aid like it mattered. Their fear hadn't fully gone away. But it was no longer the only feeling in the room. There was something else now. A quiet sense of trust trying to form. The house was still silent, but it no longer felt empty. The moment felt shared. The grandparent took a slow breath and nodded once. "All right," they said. "But please be careful." He smiled slightly, not a big grin, just a small one. "I will," he said. He leaned back over the table, returning his focus to the task. The tools stayed neatly in place. The hearing aid rested safely on the cloth. The grandparent watched him, heart still uneasy but steady enough to wait. Whatever happened next, they realized, something important had already changed. For the first time that day, they didn't feel completely alone. The grandparent sat very still at the table, hands folded together, eyes fixed on the small device resting on the cloth. Every part of them wanted to reach out and stop what was happening. The hearing aid felt too important, too fragile, to be trusted in anyone else's hands. Especially hands so young. They swallowed slowly. Their heart beat a little faster than usual. Trust had never come easily to them. Life had taught them to be careful, to hold on tightly to the things that mattered, because once something broke, it was not always possible to put it back together. They watched the grandson lean closer to the table. His shoulders relaxed as he focused. He adjusted the light slightly so it fell directly onto the hearing aid. The glow reflected off the small surface, highlighting tiny details the grandparent had never noticed before. A quiet thought crept in. This is my hearing. My connection to the world. One wrong move and it could be gone. Their fingers twitched. For a brief moment, they almost spoke. Almost told him to stop. Almost reached across the table to take the device back. But then a memory surfaced. It came without warning, clear and sharp. They remembered a small toy car from years ago. It had stopped working one afternoon, its wheels frozen in place. The grandson had been much younger then, sitting on the floor with his legs crossed. While others had shrugged and said it was broken, he had picked it up and turned it over in his hands. I think something's stuck, he had said back then. They remembered watching him pry it open carefully, tongue pressed against his lip in concentration. Inside, a piece of thread had wrapped around the axle. He had removed it slowly, then snapped the car back together. It had rolled perfectly afterward. Another memory followed. An old radio that only played static. The grandson had been curious, not careless. He had asked questions. He had listened. He had fixed it enough that music returned, faint but real. Then there were the phones. Old ones, no longer used. He had taken them apart, laid out the pieces in neat rows, just to see how they worked. Not to destroy them. To understand them. The grandparent shifted slightly in their chair. These memories piled up quietly, one after another. They realized something they hadn't before. The grandson didn't rush things. He didn't panic when something didn't work. He paid attention. The grandparent looked back at him now, really looked. His hands were steady. Not stiff, not trembling. Steady in a way that came from focus, not confidence alone. His breathing was calm. His movements were slow and deliberate. The tension in the room felt thick, like a held breath. The house remained silent, but it was no longer empty silence. It was waiting. The grandparent leaned back slightly, forcing themselves not to interfere. It went against every instinct they had. Protecting things had always been their role. Protecting people too. But this moment felt different. They realized they weren't just protecting a hearing aid. They were holding on to control. That thought made their chest tighten. Getting older had come with many small losses. Strength. Speed. Independence. The hearing aid itself was already proof of that. Letting someone else handle it felt like admitting how much they needed help. Their pride whispered that this was a mistake. Their fear agreed. But something quieter spoke too. Something softer. What if this isn't about losing control? What if it's about sharing it? The grandson picked up the tiny screwdriver. He turned it between his fingers, checking the tip. Then he placed it down again. Instead of opening anything, he used the cloth to gently wipe the surface of the hearing aid. The grandparent noticed how careful he was. He didn't press hard. He didn't rush. He cleaned the edges, the small openings, places dust could hide. Their breathing slowed without them realizing it. The boy paused and glanced up briefly, checking the grandparent's face. Not for permission this time. For reassurance. The grandparent nodded once. Just a small movement. But it meant everything. He returned to his work. Time seemed to stretch. Each second felt longer than the last. The grandparent could hear their own heartbeat, dull and steady in their ears. They wondered if this was how parents felt when they let go for the first time. The grandson leaned closer again. He examined the hearing aid through the magnifying lens, adjusting it slightly until his eyes narrowed with focus. There, he murmured to himself. The grandparent leaned forward without thinking. What? They asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He adjusted the angle again, then nodded slightly. There's stuff inside, he said. Not broken stuff. Just dirt. The grandparent's eyebrows rose. Inside. Near the opening, he replied. Where sound goes in. That made sense. The grandparent had never thought about it before, but they wore the device every day. Dust, skin, small things could build up over time. I won't open it unless I have to, the grandson added quickly. I think I can clean it first. The grandparent hesitated again. Opening it still felt risky. But cleaning. They took another slow breath. Okay, they said softly. The grandson picked up a small brush from the table. It was barely bigger than a toothbrush for a doll. He brushed gently along the opening, tapping lightly so loose particles fell onto the cloth. The grandparent watched closely. Their hands stayed folded, though it took effort not to reach out. Every movement felt important. A few tiny specks appeared on the cloth. Barely visible, but there. That's probably what was making the noise, the grandson said. It can mess with the sound. The grandparent felt a mix of relief and disbelief. Could it really be that simple? The boy continued cleaning, working slowly, carefully. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His focus said enough. The room remained quiet, but the tension began to ease. It no longer felt like waiting for something bad to happen. It felt like watching something careful unfold. The grandparent noticed their shoulders had dropped. They hadn't realized how tense they had been until now. They thought again about trust. About how hard it had always been for them. They had learned to rely on themselves early in life. To fix their own problems. To not expect help. But sitting there now, watching the grandson work, they felt something shift. Trust wasn't weakness. It was a choice. The grandson set the brush down and looked up again. I think it's better now, he said. But I want to check one more thing. The grandparent nodded. Take your time. Those words surprised even them. He smiled faintly and returned to the task. He used the cloth again, then inspected the device one final time. The grandparent waited. Fear still lingered, but it no longer controlled them. They felt something else instead. Faith. Not blind faith. Not careless faith. Faith built on memory, observation, and quiet understanding. For the first time since the hearing aid had failed, the grandparent didn't feel helpless. They felt involved. Present. Connected. Whatever the outcome, they realized something important had already happened. They had chosen faith over fear. And that choice felt louder than silence. The grandson kept working without rushing, his attention fixed on the small device in front of him. After a moment, he began to speak, not loudly, not to impress, but simply because he felt the grandparent should know what he was doing. I think the sound problem started because of a few things, he said. Not just one. The grandparent leaned in slightly, listening closely, watching his hands as much as his face. There was dust, he continued, pointing carefully with the tip of the brush. Tiny stuff. You can't really see it unless you look close. It gets stuck where sound goes in. He paused, then added, and there's a little part inside that moves. It wasn't broken. Just loose. The grandparent felt a quiet surprise rise inside them. He wasn't guessing. He wasn't pretending. He was explaining. How do you know all this? The grandparent asked softly. The boy shrugged slightly, still focused. I like watching how things work, he said. Sometimes I look things up. Sometimes I just notice. He adjusted the hearing aid again, turning it carefully between his fingers. Most things don't just stop working for no reason, he added. There's usually a small problem that makes a big one. Those words settled in the air between them. The grandparent watched him closely now, not just the task, but the way he carried himself. The calm. The patience. The care. This wasn't the restless energy they often associated with children. This was something else. You taught yourself? The grandparent asked. He nodded. Mostly, he replied. I ask questions sometimes. But I like figuring things out. The grandparent felt a shift inside their chest. A realization, slow but clear. They had known the grandson was curious. They had seen him take things apart. They had smiled at it, even laughed sometimes. But they hadn't really paid attention to what it meant. They hadn't seen the discipline behind it. They hadn't seen the responsibility. They felt a small ache of regret. Not painful, just honest. How many times had they brushed it off as a phase? How many times had they assumed he would grow out of it? Now, sitting across from him, they saw it differently. This wasn't play. This was purpose. The grandson reached for the tiny screwdriver again, tightening something with a careful twist. He didn't force it. He stopped as soon as it felt right. If you push too hard, he said quietly, you make it worse. The grandparent nodded. That lesson felt familiar. He set the tool down and wiped his hands on the cloth, then looked up. I think it's okay now, he said. But there's one more thing. The grandparent waited. There's a battery contact, he explained. If it's not touching right, the sound cuts out. He opened the battery compartment gently and adjusted the small metal piece inside. His movements were precise, almost practiced. The grandparent felt something warm rise in their chest. Pride, maybe. But also something deeper. Respect. They realized they weren't watching a child try to help. They were watching someone take responsibility. The grandson closed the compartment and set the hearing aid down carefully. He looked up again, searching the grandparent's face. I didn't want it to break, he said. That's why I took my time. The grandparent swallowed. Their throat felt tight. I can see that, they replied. The boy hesitated for a moment, then spoke again. Sometimes people think I'm just messing around, he said. But I'm not. Those words landed quietly, but they carried weight. The grandparent felt a sharp clarity then. They saw how often children were underestimated. How often their efforts were misunderstood. How easy it was to miss moments like this. They leaned back slightly, looking at the grandson with new eyes. You're not just messing around, they said firmly. I see that now. The boy's shoulders relaxed just a little. The room felt different. Warmer. Closer. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt shared. The grandparent realized something important in that moment. This wasn't really about the hearing aid anymore. It was about being seen. About being trusted. About being valued. They had spent so much time worrying about losing things as they grew older. Hearing. Independence. Control. But sitting here now, they felt something being gained instead. Connection. The grandson reached for the hearing aid and held it out carefully. You can try it now, he said. The grandparent took it slowly, their hands gentler than before. They paused for a second, looking at the device, then at the boy. Thank you, they said. He nodded. I hope it works. They placed the hearing aid back in their ear and turned it on. For a brief moment, nothing happened. The grandparent held their breath. Then sound returned. Clearer than before. The faint hum of the room. The distant noise outside. The soft rustle of clothing as the boy shifted in his chair. The grandparents' eyes widened slightly. It's better, they said, almost in disbelief. The boy smiled then. A real smile this time. The grandparent felt a sting behind their eyes and blinked slowly. They laughed softly, a sound filled with relief and emotion. You did this, they said. We did, the boy replied. That simple correction mattered. The grandparent reached across the table and rested a hand near his. Not touching, just close enough to feel present. I'm proud of you, they said. The boy looked down, a little shy now, but pleased. The quiet bond between them settled in gently. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just real. In that moment, the grandparent understood something they hadn't before. Being needed didn't always mean being the one in charge. Sometimes, it meant letting someone else step forward. And sometimes, the greatest gift wasn't fixing what was broken. It was seeing the person who did. The grandson sat back slightly in his chair, his work finished. He wiped his hands on the cloth one last time and folded it neatly, as if closing the moment with care. Then he picked up the hearing aid and held it out, resting it gently on his open palm. The grandparent looked at the device for a long second. It seemed smaller than before, lighter somehow, though they knew that wasn't true. What had changed was the weight of the moment. Their hands hovered, unsure. "All done," the boy said quietly. The grandparent nodded and reached out. Their fingers closed around the hearing aid, warm from his hands. They turned it slowly, checking it the way they always did, even though the routine felt different now. They hesitated. A small doubt crept in, uninvited. What if it didn't work? What if the sound was worse than before? What if nothing happened at all? The boy noticed the pause. He didn't rush them. He didn't speak. He simply watched, eyes steady, face open. The grandparent lifted the hearing aid and placed it carefully into their ear. The motion was familiar, practiced. They pressed the small button and waited. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the world came back. Not all at once, but gently, like a curtain being pulled open. The first thing they noticed was the room. The soft hum they hadn't realized they missed. The faint buzz of electricity. The quiet presence of the house itself. Then came smaller sounds. The scrape of a chair leg. The rustle of fabric. The slow, steady breathing of the boy sitting across from them. The grandparent blinked. The sound was clearer. Sharper. It felt fuller than before, as if someone had cleaned a foggy window they didn't know was dirty. They turned their heads slightly, listening. The distant noise from outside drifted in. A car passing. A bird calling. Things they hadn't heard clearly in weeks, maybe longer. Their chest tightened. They swallowed and laughed softly, the sound catching in their throat. "I can hear," they said. The boy leaned forward a little. "Better?" he asked. "Yes," the grandparent replied, their voice unsteady. "Much better." They looked at him, really looked at him. The way his eyes searched their face, not for praise, but for truth. He wanted to know if it had worked. He needed to know. The grandparent nodded. It was a simple movement. Small. Quiet. But it meant everything. The boy's shoulders dropped, relief spreading across his face. A smile appeared, slow and real, like he had been holding it back until he was sure. "I thought it would," he said. "But I wasn't sure." The grandparent reached up and touched the hearing aid lightly, as if to confirm it was real. Sound stayed steady. No crackle. No sudden silence. Emotion rose fast and unexpected. Their eyes burned, and they had to blink again. They hadn't realized how much they had missed hearing properly until it returned. "It sounds clean," they said, searching for the right word. The boy nodded. "That's what it should sound like." The grandparent laughed softly again. This time, the sound came easily. They could hear it clearly, warm and full. They leaned back in their chair, letting the moment settle. The house felt alive again. Not loud. Just present. The boy stayed where he was, watching closely. He didn't celebrate. He didn't jump up. He simply waited, reading the grandparent's expression. After a moment, the grandparent met his eyes. "You fixed it," they said. The boy shook his head slightly. "I helped it," he replied. The grandparent smiled. "You did more than help." They sat in silence for a few seconds, both taking in what had just happened. The tension that had filled the room earlier was gone. In its place was something steady and calm. The grandparent noticed things they hadn't before. The quiet ticking of the clock. The faint sound of air moving through the room. The small, familiar noises that made a house feel like home. They felt a deep sense of relief, but also something else. Gratitude. Not just for the hearing aid working again, but for the moment itself. For being reminded that help could come from unexpected places. They leaned forward slightly. "I was scared," they admitted. "When I saw you with it." The boy nodded. "I know. I almost stopped you, the grandparent said. I know, he repeated gently. They smiled at each other. The grandparent reached out and placed a hand over his, this time not hesitating. The boy didn't pull away. Thank you for being careful, the grandparent said. And for caring. The boy shrugged, but his smile stayed. I just wanted you to hear, he said. Those words settled deep. The grandparent squeezed his hand lightly, then let go. They sat back, listening again, just because they could. They turned their head, testing the sound. Everything held steady. The hearing aid worked better than it had in a long time. The boy finally relaxed fully, leaning back in his chair. The task was done. The waiting was over. The grandparent looked at him and felt something settle firmly in their heart. This was a moment they would remember. Not because something was fixed, but because something had been trusted. And something had been proven. A simple nod had turned into a memory neither of them would ever forget. The house stayed quiet after the moment passed, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It no longer felt empty or heavy. It felt calm, like a pause after something important. The grandparents sat back in the chair, listening. Not just to the sounds around them, but to how those sounds made them feel. The steady ticking of the clock felt comforting. The faint noise from outside felt grounding. It reminded them that the world was close again, not distant. They hadn't realized how far they had drifted. Without meaning to, they had pulled back over time. Conversations felt tiring when they had to keep asking people to repeat themselves. They had started nodding instead of responding. Smiling instead of speaking. Sitting quietly instead of joining in. It hadn't felt like a choice at first. It had felt easier. But sitting there now, hearing clearly again, they saw it for what it was. A slow retreat. I didn't notice how quiet I'd become, the grandparent said softly. The boy looked at them, listening. I thought I was just getting older, the grandparent continued. But I think I was stepping back. The words surprised them as they said them. They hadn't planned to speak so honestly. But the moment felt safe. The grandson nodded. I noticed, he said. The grandparent turned toward him. You did. He hesitated, then nodded again. You didn't talk as much, he said. And sometimes you didn't answer right away. I thought maybe you were tired of me. That sentence landed quietly, but it hit deep. The grandparents' chest tightened. No, they said quickly. Never that. I know now, the boy replied. But I didn't before. They sat with that truth for a moment. The grandparent reached for the arm of the chair, steadying themselves. They hadn't meant to cause distance. They hadn't even seen it happening. But the silence had been shaping their days without them realizing it. I didn't want to bother people, the grandparent admitted. When I couldn't hear well, I felt like I was always slowing things down. The boy frowned slightly. You weren't, he said. I know that now, the grandparent replied. The grandson leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I wanted to help, he said. Not just with the hearing thing. I just missed you. The grandparents' eyes filled, and this time they didn't look away. I missed you too, they said. The room felt warmer as the words settled between them. They realized then that the hearing aid hadn't just failed their ears. It had quietly affected their heart. The silence had made them feel separate, even when they weren't alone. The grandson had experienced the silence differently. He had felt it as distance, as absence, as something he didn't have words for until now. I could tell you were still here, he said, but it felt like you were far away. The grandparent nodded slowly. That made sense. I didn't mean to go anywhere, they said. I know, the boy replied. They sat together, letting the understanding grow. The grandparent thought about how many moments they might have half missed. Small comments, quiet jokes, questions that never got asked because they hadn't heard them clearly. They felt a mix of sadness and gratitude. Sadness for what had slipped by. Gratitude for what hadn't. This fixed more than sound, the grandparent said quietly. The boy smiled. I thought so. The grandparent laughed softly. You saw it before I did. He shrugged. I just noticed things were different. The grandparent looked at him with new appreciation. Not just for his skill, but for his awareness. For caring enough to act. They realized the fix had been symbolic without either of them planning it that way. Dust cleared from a small opening. A loose connection tightened. And something between them had been restored. They reached out and rested a hand on the table between them. I don't want to be quiet like that anymore, the grandparent said. The boy nodded. Me neither. They shared a small smile. The house filled with ordinary sounds again, but now those sounds felt meaningful. Proof that connection had returned. They hadn't just regained hearing. They had regained each other. From that day forward, something in the house shifted in a quiet but lasting way. Nothing dramatic happened all at once. There were no big announcements or promises. Change arrived slowly, settling into daily life the same way light moved across the rooms. The grandparent found themselves listening differently. Not just because the hearing aid worked better, but because they were more present. When the grandson spoke, they turned toward him fully. They looked at his face. They listened with patience instead of guessing what he meant. They noticed things they had missed before. The way his voice changed when he was excited. The pauses when he was unsure. The small details in his stories that once slipped past. The grandson noticed too. He began to talk more. At first, it was small things. Comments about something he saw outside. Questions about how things used to be. Thoughts he might have kept to himself before. Each time the grandparent responded, really responded, his confidence grew. He no longer checked to see if he was being heard. He knew. The grandparent also changed in ways they hadn't expected. They asked more questions. They invited conversation instead of waiting for it. When the grandson explained something, they listened without interrupting. They realized how often they had filled silence with distance instead of connection. Now, silence was shared. Mornings felt warmer. They sat together at the table longer than before. Not always talking, but present. Comfortable. The house felt less like separate rooms and more like one shared space. In the afternoons, the grandson would sometimes bring small projects to the table. A broken toy. A loose hinge. Something he wanted to understand. The grandparent didn't rush him or dismiss it. They watched. They asked questions. They learned. And sometimes, they simply listened as he explained his thinking, step by careful step. The grandson stood a little taller during those moments. Not physically, but in the way he carried himself. He felt trusted. Capable. Seen. He no longer worked quietly in the background. He shared. The grandparent found joy in that. A deep, steady joy that came from understanding rather than control. They realized trust wasn't something you declared. It was something you practiced every day in small ways. Conversations that once felt effortful now came naturally. Laughter returned to the house, soft and unexpected. Sometimes it surprised them both. The distance that had grown so quietly before now faded just as quietly. The grandparent reflected on how easily silence could be misunderstood. How quickly it could turn into space between people. They were grateful they had noticed in time. The grandson felt that gratitude too, even if he didn't say it out loud. He felt safer speaking up. Safer trying. Safer being himself. They didn't talk about trust often. They lived it. Through shared time. Through listening. Through believing in each other. The house, once so quiet in the wrong way, now felt full. Not of noise, but of connection. And in that space, something strong had taken root. Understanding. Respect. Trust. It became the foundation they both stood on, steady and real, carrying them forward together. As the days passed, the moment at the table didn't fade the way most moments did. It stayed. Not loudly, not in the front of the mind, but quietly, shaping how the grandparents saw the world. They found themselves thinking about it during ordinary routines. While making tea. While sitting by the window. While listening to the small sounds that now felt like gifts instead of background noise. They realized how close they had come to missing something important. Not the hearing aid, but the connection. For a long time, they had believed help only came from certain places. From adults. From professionals. From people who were supposed to know better. Age, they thought, was tied to wisdom. That belief had felt safe. But it had also been limiting. Sitting in that quiet house, now full in a different way, the grandparent understood something clearly. Help can come from anywhere. Even from someone small. Even from someone young. They smiled to themselves at the thought. Life had a way of teaching lessons when you least expected them. This one had arrived gently, carried by steady hands and two simple words spoken with confidence. Trust me. They thought about how easily they could have said no. How easily fear could have won. How easily the moment could have ended before it began. But trust, once given, had changed everything. The grandson felt the change too. He didn't speak about it much, but he carried it with him. In the way he approached things. In the way he explained his ideas. In the way he believed his actions mattered. He had learned that what he did made a difference. That his care had weight. That responsibility wasn't something you waited to grow into. It was something you stepped into when given the chance. The grandparent watched him now with a quiet sense of pride. Not because he had fixed something, but because he had cared enough to try. Because he had noticed. Because he had acted. They understood then that youth did not limit ability. And age did not hold all the answers. What mattered was attention. What mattered was respect. What mattered was believing in someone enough to let them show you who they are. The house continued on as it always had. Meals were shared. Time passed. Life moved forward. But something fundamental had changed. There was more listening now. More trust. More understanding. The silence that once separated them no longer had power. It had been replaced by presence. By shared moments. By the quiet certainty that they mattered to each other. In the end, the lesson was simple. Sometimes, believing in someone is the greatest gift you can give. And sometimes, when that belief is placed in a child, it can save more than sound. It can save more than one heart.